Hello and welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes, and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. Today, I'm really excited about our guest because he's someone who's got a unique perspective on generational communication. He's the chair of the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales, also the chair of local partnerships and chair of the Local Chairs Forum. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Keith Fraser. Hi, Keith.
Hi, Alastair. Great to be having a chat with you today.
Well, thank you for joining us because, as I said in the introduction, you do have a unique perspective of generational communication. And I want to start off, if that's okay, as we always do, talking about your generation. And you are a Gen X, but also a little bit of a cusper because you're close to Boomer as well. But we won't go into too much detail on that. But can you maybe just give us an idea? First of all, do you think you are typical of that latchkey generation growing up and so on? How do you see yourself as a Gen X?
Good grief. I don't know if I'd describe myself as a latchkey. I'm not quite sure about. Am I typical? I don't know is the answer to that. So I'll have to let everybody else, after they've heard what I say, answer that question. So I grew up in a very supportive household, mum and dad. Mum stopped work, be at home and look after me. Dad carried on working. Dad was a bus driver. Mum was a secretary, business support, clerical supporter up at British Leyland. For those of us that are old enough to remember that, Mum works there. So very skilled in that area, and those skills I suppose have translated on now to what we now know as the computer. But it was all around a typewriter. I think there's probably a lot of people around who've never seen a typewriter. Yeah. No, I feel very lucky in the environment I was brought up in. Grew up in Birmingham, in a place called Bourneville. I found there was a very, very strong community spirit through the school and also the local area. Lots of the kids lived nearby. A lot of my friends lived nearby. Had family nearby to me as well. So I was very, very lucky in relation to my childhood. But I wouldn't say I was latchkey. I couldn't stick my hand to a letterbox and open the back door or the front door. Mum was always about it if I needed her, and so was Dad.
And that was actually that was the difference really between the boomers before you and the younger Gen X's was that thing that both parents were very often working, and that was the big transition. So you had probably a more traditional childhood in that respect, the fact that your mum was at home. And growing up in that period in Bourneville, what was that like?
It was probably, now looking back at it, quite unusual, but it was usual for me because Bourneville's quite a green place, really, in the middle of a city. I had my both junior and infant school, as they used to be called. Don't really look like schools. They're buildings that were built by the Cadbury family. The Cadbury family were very much around trying to make sure the environment was right for the people that lived in it. So there's a lot of parks in the area. I remember playing racing boats, and racing bits of sticks that were boats on the way to school with my dad. Every now and again, I always wanted my dad to take me to school because he would be the one who was a little bit more playful with me going to school. I hope Mum's not going to see this, by the way, because she'll tell me off. But he was always a little bit more playful taking me to school, and we'd do some games on the way into school, whereas Mum was very focused on making sure I got to school on time and getting me in there. But Dad would always have a bit of a game with me, or we might detour through the park so we can, play some games in the park and stuff like that. Or if it snowed, we'd have sledging all the way from my door almost to school if it snowed. So I used to love it if it snowed because Dad would basically drag me all the way, not face first, by the way, on my feet, all the way to school.
How strict were you? You were implying there that your mum was a little bit more strict than your dad, but would you say it was a fairly strict, straight upbringing, or was it a little bit more liberal?
Good grief. Blimey. It's a difficult one. It's a difficult one to answer. They were very precise about what was right and wrong. And they were very clear on expectations around me, around behaviour. But my mum, probably more so my dad, was very gentle in relation to how he pushed my aspirations. And that got stronger as I got older. Whatever I achieved, he was always telling everybody else I'd done the next level. So, like, for example, we jump on a bit, when I got into policing, he'd always tell everybody I was a sergeant when I was a PC. And so that subtly got me to kind of go for the next rank, and he'd do that all the time. Unfortunately, the next one he said, he didn't actually see me achieve that rank, although I did achieve that rank, but he's up in heaven now watching down. So hopefully he knows that I got that. So extremely supportive. It drove my aspirations in a very subtle way, but a very, very, very supportive way. And things that I wanted to do in the future, they were very, very supportive of. Like, I'd wanted to be a police officer from when I was a very young kid. I know that a lot of young people haven't necessarily kind of formulated their ideas, but from the age of about 9 or 10, I wanted to be a police officer. And the first time I applied, I was 14. So I was very kind of committed to it. And I got a brilliant response back from the Home Office as well, a personally written letter encouraging me to apply, giving me some advice and tips and also information. And so I used that to guide myself through school and also in relation to what I attained so I could actually get that job.
Now, policing, as we all know, has changed tremendously over the years, both internally and externally. And I wonder if a 14-year-old Keith Fraser today would get that same response from the Home Office. Yes, it might be a WhatsApp message or an email, but I wonder if that would still happen.
I'd like to think so, but perhaps not, because as we think, we think to do now is how to become more efficient and more effective around how we do things. And my hope is that through that efficiency and effectiveness that we want to do, we don't forget the human being in that, because that's the kind of golden platinum nugget in all of this. How do we remember the human being in all of those contacts? Because potentially, if I didn't get that letter back from the Home Office, I might not be sat where I'm sat now, where that person took that time. It wasn't a long letter, but they took that time to make an individual response. If you've got AI or a computer, they'll see us on 14 and it will just be a straightforward rejection by the computer says no, and that's it. So I'd say I'm probably less likely to receive an individualized human response, although some would argue and say the computer's trying to get you a more individualized computer response. But I think it's something that a human being can do that AI and computers can't necessarily do, although we're trying to perfect.
So you were an only child. You were brought up in this sort of environment. How do you think that shaped you in your later work in the police and also as the chair of the Youth Justice Board? How much of a benefit do you think that upbringing gave you when you then went into those areas of work?
Yeah, I wasn't an only child. I was an only child up until about the age of 11. So I've got two brothers, and I'll have to give them a bit of a mention, or else I'll get told off by them as well if they're fortunate enough to listen to me on this. I think what it's done for me, looking back, has been it's shown me the gaps there are in a number of children's lives, unfortunately, where there's things that they can't take for granted that I take for granted, i.e. that there is somebody there that is always going to be looking out for the responsive. I had trusted adults in my life constantly. I had adults around me that loved me. I had adults around me, and that's not just my mum and dad, it's the wider family as well that supported me, and a very strong family network. Now, looking forward, I could see by the amount of children's lives that I impacted in a professional way, that wasn't the case for everybody. You know, for example, I was thinking about my dad coming home at the weekends on a Friday, and he'd always have a treat for me. But I had to search him to try and find which pocket that treat was in. Now, there's a number of kids, if they make choices, their choices they make are totally different to mine, because whatever choice I made, I knew in the end I would be okay and I'd be happy. But some children just didn't have that, and still have that opportunity about being able to make those choices which support them in relation to having an enjoyable and better lives. So it did help me, because it showed me the basics and the fundamentals that we all need in our lives. And some of these things now that state and also society and communities can do, and they don't cost money. But unfortunately, I don't think there's enough emphasis in relation to government's objectives and the state's objectives and ours on those things that don't necessarily cost money to actually bring about some quite significant changes.
Were you aware of any of this growing up? Could you see that sort of inequality growing up? And do you think that's the spurred you on a little bit to go ahead and do what you did?
I don't think it was more around seeing the inequality. It was more around my parents and how I saw them giving to communities and wanting the best out of communities. That was a thing that spurred me into what I'm doing now initially. And mother talking about policing and stuff, because we had family in policing in Jamaica. So I hear quite positive stories around what they were up to in policing in Jamaica. So I suppose, having parents who gave a lot and give a lot to the community and didn't expect much back, then a positive, stories about policing then spurred me on to, into a career in policing. But then it's only once you're there and exposed to policing and the things that I do now that you become more aware of those inequalities and the way that people are treated differently. Sometimes because of obvious difference, and sometimes because of difference that you can't see. And it's frustrating. It makes you angry, but it makes you also more determined to kind of do something about it, because one, it's wrong, but two, it's just ridiculous that people treat each other in that way, because it's inhuman in it, but also it doesn't support us in relation to having the best society and the best community that we can have.
The way that we communicate now is so different. I'm not just talking about the obvious technological differences, but just attitudes and so on. And certainly when we think about, the police interaction with individuals and police interacting with youngsters today versus the way that police interacted with youngsters when you were a teenager. Could you talk maybe a little bit about that and how you see those changes, and more importantly, framing it in the perspective of those youngsters and the police themselves?
I think there's a couple of things going on. There's two things going on simultaneously. In the communication with you saw more police officers out and about on foot, so you had greater interaction with them. They'd have to be tested out before the police start to say, no, there's more of us out there. But there's kind of a general feeling, but I don't think that feeling's changed actually, that you don't see enough police on the streets interacting with the community, and that's always been, even for when I was back there and doing the job. But to answer your question around communication, I think there still needs to be a greater focus on that, and a greater focus on the police and neighbourhood policing. But the challenge for policing is it's got more complex. So as society has got more complex, the ask of police has got more complex, and there's some real tensions there around policing being able to meet that neighbourhood policing demand and having local police officers out in communities where I think is absolutely critical, because that there's nothing that beats that face-to-face communication. We might get more effective and more efficient through the different means of contact, but nothing beats that face-to-face human interaction. The science will support. I'm not sure if I quite answered your question there. If I'm just thinking now whether or not I've answered your question. Go on.
Yeah, no, I think what's interesting is that a lot of it's always about perception. And, when you talked about the amount of police on the street, there's a perception of something and the reality might be different, but it is that perception. Looking at your work, how did you get involved in the youth side of communication and looking after youth and youth justice? How was that transition, and how much have you seen a difference in all those years you've been involved with it?
I'll start off with the last question. How much have I seen a difference in relation to children and youth work since I've been involved in it? I think we've got a better understanding now. We've become smarter about what we need to do. We become more joined up. We work together better. When I was first involved in this area, for example, in policing, you had all these silos of different parts of the system doing its bit and thinking, what should we be doing around children and around the youth justice system. When you had the Act that came in 1998, it forced various statutory partners to come together and work together. I think we've seen a significant benefit there as a result of those statutory partners working together. I think one of the things that we've got, although we've got better at working together has reduced the number of children coming into the system. We've got better at preventing children from coming into the system and preventing harm to children and also to communities and also to victims. One of the things that really, I'll use the word shocked me, was the concentration of vulnerability in the youth justice system. So the youth justice system isn't necessarily, although children do bad things, I'm not going to say that they don't, and they'll do things that are wrong. I was shocked and really surprised at the concentration of children with vulnerabilities in the justice system, and also the overrepresentation of various different groups, whether it be children from ethnic minority backgrounds or children who are care experienced or children who have speech, language and communication needs, children who have mental health needs, substance misuse needs. I was really shocked at the concentration of children with vulnerabilities in the justice system. That's not excusing the behaviour. Nothing I will talk about will excuse the behaviour. But for me, it then really gave me some real strong evidence to say, well, the solution to what's happening within the justice system and the things that kids do that are wrong is not necessarily just with the justice system, it's before. Because if you're looking at speech, language and communication needs, if you're looking at kids who've been excluded, overrepresented in the justice system, children from minority communities, overrepresented, children who have mental health needs, that looks for me to health, education, social care, sports and sports and physical activity, protective services. All of those agencies and others should be doing more to support the positive outcomes in children's lives. And there seems to be evidence there for me that kids are slipping through some gaps in relation to the decisions that adults are making that then lend them more likely, not inevitably, to come into the justice system.
You touched on something there in terms of almost slight positivity that we're able to identify better. We've got organisations working together better, so we're able to identify issues. And one of the things that you told me when we had a phone call beforehand was about your diagnosis of dyslexia and the fact that it happened quite late in life, where nowadays I think it's pretty universal that it's identified pretty early. Is that your take on it? And what? Maybe not. Okay. So what is your take on that? If it's not been identified, why not? What's going wrong? And what impact that's having on our young people, the fact that it is often identified earlier?
Okay, two things. One, if I talk about from my perspective, first of all, I knew that I had some challenges around spelling, reading, and writing. I always knew that. I just didn't understand what was driving that challenge. So I'd do all sorts of courses and stuff like that to kind of mitigate and manage it. And I found all sorts of coping mechanisms. And it wasn't until in my mid-40s, I won't go through the whole process now, so I actually found out what was wrong with me in inverted commas. And two things happened then when I found out that I was dyslexic. One, it was kind of reassuring because I now understood what was going on. But also, number two, it was quite scary as well because I now had a disability as far as everybody else saw it. And who was I going to tell about it? What impacts was that going to have on me as an individual and how society viewed me and how I was able to carry on doing my job, despite the fact I was a senior cop at the time, doing an okay job, I think. All those things then went through my head. And initially the focus was around reasonable adjustments. That's what an organisation does and how it provides those reasonable adjustments. I think the real significant shift was I met somebody called Professor Amanda Kirby, who then spoke to me about the strength that you've got, as being somebody who's neurodivergent. So one of the challenges spoke about the strengths, and I really did see myself differently then as a result, and then understood how I was able to do what I was doing. In relation to identification, you're talking about children. I think that you could look at about 20% of the population are neurodivergent in some way, and it's not just one box. I've probably got another bit which I don't know, in relation to neurodivergence. I'll have to test that and find out what that is, because you're on a scale, really. But about 20% of the population is neurodivergent. We're identifying more and more children that are neurodivergent, but I think it's the ability of the state to ensure that children are systematically tested, and I don't think we're doing that. And then if children are, then are we able to deliver the right response? Those things are getting better, but I think it's how does the system cope with actually meeting a need which we know is there already in relation to, because the science will tell us there's about 20% of the population neurodivergent, but those kids and children are still slipping through the net because either they're not identified and they're not identified until they get to the justice system or the edge of the justice system, or they're identified and there's not sort of then an appropriate response. So things are getting better, but we're not there yet. So there still needs, I think, an increased focus on there because there's wasted opportunities there. And also we're potentially creating harm for children by not dealing with their needs.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we know is that children, from the work I do in schools, children are that much more aware of each other than they ever were. And therefore, if something isn't diagnosed, it seems almost more unforgivable than ever before because we are aware of it. We do know it's out there. And therefore, it seems so wrong to not identify it. Where do you feel the relationship between schools and the various bodies that you work with and parents and supporting parents in helping them? Because I personally feel that being a parent today is a tougher job than it's ever been in history. Life is so much more complex. There's a lot more going on. What do you think can be given to parents to give them more support? What's the role is there maybe for the state or for schools or for other bodies to support parents in assessing their children and helping their children through those early years?
I think it works both ways, really. I think there's one is how can we support schools and teachers more, because we all know to give kids a bespoke education, builds on their learning needs is the right thing to do and the best thing to do. But have schools got the resources? Have teachers got the resources to be able to do that? So they need to look at how you're supporting teachers to do that. Then also, I think it's parents trusting their gut, trusting what they feel and what they can see in their children. They know their children better than anybody else, I would suggest. So if they can see something before there's any kind of formal diagnosis, is about asking for help. And then the second piece of that for me would then be around the authorities listening. I spoke to a mum not too long ago whose child was diagnosed, is now a young man diagnosed with autism when he was about 13, 14, but she'd been trying to get help from the age of about 2 or 3. And the system was actually disputing what the mother was saying the child's needs were, yet the mum was saying, look, I'm spotting this difference. The state, the schools weren't seeing that difference, but the kid was just masking his behaviour in effect and behaving differently in order to cope in those situations. So, for me, it's one around the parents is really trusting what you can see in that child and looking for support and help. And then the other bit is around schools really listening to parents. But I do recognise that when I say to schools, listen to parents, there is a resourcing and a capacity and a capability issue which needs to be tackled by, on a wider level really through the education department, etc., just in making sure that schools are properly equipped to deal with that need.
Do you think there's a bit of a challenge with some maybe older generations not being as receptive to the challenges of today as maybe they could be, in terms of, when you hear comments like, what's going on with mental health, there was never that when we were young, and, those kind of unhelpful comments. Do you think that is a real issue, or is that just a few headline grabbing moments?
I think it's a real issue. And I could understand why it's a real issue, because a lot of the challenges, say like around mental health or neurodiversity, we just didn't have a label to attach to it if you're going back a few decades. So it wasn't understood, and people either got on and muddled on and were pushed through, or if you were what other people would label as as I want to use some of the disparaging words that come to mind, but you were not up to it, and then you were pushed to one side, and that might lead to premature hospitalisation, for example, or you being put into some kind of institution or society just discarding you and saying that you couldn't do anything. What we've now seen is, because we're able to understand what's happening to human beings in relation to the mind a lot more, our response has become more flexible. I think that is right. So I think that what you're saying is absolutely spot on. It's understandable, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's necessarily forgivable. I think it needs to be a little bit more caring, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more understanding of each other, because the number of children, and these children I'm talking about are now adults, that, as I've mentored and all the rest of it, who've gone through the justice system, the thing that was often missing in their life was somebody who cared and asked them what was happening and what was going on and why did they feel in this way, or why did they behave in that way. Now, the attitude that you're talking about just responds to the behaviour and what people can see without trying to gain that understanding. Gaining understanding does not cost money.
Yeah, and one of the things I talk about, the purpose of this podcast is to help people hopefully have an insight to a world that they might not be familiar with. And so much of that comes down to communication. And, we've literally scratched the surface of it today. But one of the things I want to really finish up on is just your take, with your experience with the youth justice and so on, that so much is down to communication or lack of it. What do you think we can do as just the general public to improve that communication between generations, so we get less misunderstanding and hopefully less people who have to wind up in the youth justice system?
I'd say number one is to recognize that we all stereotype and we all have biases. Number two is to challenge ourselves and our beliefs and why we're thinking in that way. And number three is just to reach out and have that conversation with others, and don't think that they're not going to get it. Don't think that somebody, just because they are older, isn't going to understand and be able to communicate with somebody who's younger, and vice versa. Don't think that somebody, because they are under 18, isn't going to get it. I'm absolutely gobsmacked. So I can tell you that when I go into a talk to young people that are under 18 and their grasp on what's going on out there, what they want themselves, their understanding of society and what's going on around them is absolutely phenomenal. I'm blown away by the intellect, if I'm being quite honest. And some of those young people are in the justice system that I've spoken to. But people, they say that people do not ask them those questions. They don't ask them the why questions. They don't ask them what do you want questions. And the same will go for people who are older as well. There's a lot of knowledge in older people. Don't write them off. Also, if they're walking a little bit slower in front of you, it's because the bones aren't able to move as quickly as yours can. So be a little bit more patient. So, the final thing is just be a little bit more tolerant in questioning. If you're trying to other anybody, question why you're trying to other anybody, whether or not you're a younger or older person. Because it's very easy. Once you put them in that other box, it's very easy for you to write them off and just carry on living your life.
I wish we had more time, because I'd love to discuss more your concept of the other box. I think that's an amazing concept. But Keith, it's been an absolute pleasure. Is there anything you want to just finish off with for anybody listening today and they want to improve their communication? You've already said be curious, listen, all those kind of elements which are so important to effective communication. When it comes to youth justice particularly, is there anything you would like people to know that might overcome a preconception that they have?
The youth justice, we're looking at about 430 children that are in what we call the secure estate across England and Wales, 430. And then about only half of those have been sentenced. The other half of those are approximately on remand and haven't been sentenced. So you're looking at about 200 children plus each that have gone through the courts and have got some sentence in the system. So for me, if you look at those numbers, it's absolutely doable in relation to preventing those children coming into the system or stopping them from coming into the system. And then when you look at the number of children that have been arrested, you're looking at just under 60,000 a year. Again, those numbers, comparatively speaking, when you look at compared with the number of under 18s that you've got across England and Wales, again, they're comparatively small numbers of children. So with some focus around understanding what's going on with those children in their lives, it's doable in relation to prevention. And there's some key things around preventing it. It's around having a trusted adult in that child's life, and how do you build trusted relationships with that child or young person. How do we not respond to behavior, but we try and understand behavior? How do we not be quick to punish, but we're quicker to try and understand? So those are the things I would say is that we need to move towards. And there's not things I've said as well that says we ignore the behavior, because quite often people will play this game, and I'll underline play the game, be hard or soft around this. It's not about being hard or soft. It's about focusing on what works to support children to have better outcomes for their lives. Also to stop fewer of us becoming victims of some of the crimes that kids and young people perpetrate, and all of us to have safer communities. So it's not about hard or soft. Anybody that's trying to have a hard or soft argument isn't something that's going to have a sustainable future for fewer victims and fewer communities, because we can't lock everybody up and lock them up indefinitely. That just isn't going to work at all, and the evidence doesn't support. It is around following the evidence around what works, really. And that's why I'd like us to move more towards a justice system and bits that interact with the justice system, focusing on the evidence around what works, and we move away from this debate around what's hard or soft in relation to approach. If you think about the riots that we had, I think it was last year, there was a disproportionate, they were in various parts of the north of the country, a disproportionate number of children were arrested, but a disproportionate number of those children not had any contact with the justice system at all. So how are you going to label those kids? What are you going to do around those children? I'm not going to give you an answer here. What I'm saying, society needs to kind of question what was it? Why were those children in that situation at that time? And they'd had no previous contact with the justice system.
I think you've given us a huge amount to think about today, Keith. And that's actually one of the things I wanted to achieve out of today, was to get people to open their eyes to what's going on around them so they have a greater awareness. And having a greater awareness is the beginning of a greater understanding. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for those incredible insights. And we'll put some links on in the show notes. But in the meantime, Keith Fraser, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for watching or listening. And don't forget, we'll be back again in a couple of weeks' time. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.